Good afternoon and welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program with guest speakers Dr. William Reisinger, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and Dr. Paul Van Hooft. Thanks to each of them and to everyone who has joined us online today. I am Brett Cloyd, Social Sciences, Public Policy, and Fulbright Librarian at the University of Iowa, and I'm a member of the ICFRC's board and host for today's program. We would like to acknowledge and thank our annual donors, sponsors, and partners for their support, especially the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program, Public Policy Center, and Center for Human Rights, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, City Channel 4 for providing online access to all of ICFRC's programs, along with the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is on our website at icfrc.org. As we get started, I would like to cover some Zoom etiquette tips. Now is the time to make sure you know where your video and audio unmute buttons are located. Please keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation so as not to interrupt the speaker during their remarks.
I'm going to eat.
Okay.
Joanna, perhaps you could hit your mute button, please. Following our speakers' presentations at about 12:45 p.m., we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You'll be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. It is now my pleasure to introduce our expert speakers who will provide three perspectives on Russia's impending war against Ukraine. Dr. William Reisinger is the professor of political science at the University of Iowa. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan and joined the University of Iowa faculty in 1985. His research concerns politics in the former communist states, especially Russia. His publications include Energy in the Soviet Bloc, Can Democracy Take Root in Post-Soviet Russia?, Constitutional Dialogues in Comparative Perspective, the 1999-2000 Elections in Russia, and Russia's Regents in Comparative Subnational Politics, as well as over 50 articles and book chapters. He travels frequently to Russia and has also conducted research in China, Georgia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. He teaches courses on democratization, authoritarian politics, and the politics of the post-communist countries. He is a former chair of the Political Science Department and served as the University of Iowa's Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs from 2003 to 2008. Dr. Sarah McLaughlin Mitchell is the F. Wendell Miller Professor in the University of Iowa Department of Political Science. She received a PhD in political science at Michigan State University. She is the co-director of the Issue Correlates of War Project and an associate editor of Foreign Policy Analysis and Research in Politics. She is the co-author of Domestic Law Goes Global, Legal Traditions and International Courts, Guide to the Scientific Study of International Processes, The Triumph of Democracy and the Eclipse of the West, and Conflict, War, and Peace, an introduction to the scientific research. She has edited several specific journal issues and has published more than 30 journal articles and book chapters. Dr. Mitchell is the recipient of several major research awards from the National Science Foundation and the United States Agency for International Development, as well as numerous research grants for the University of Iowa and Florida State University. Her areas of expertise include international conflict, democratic peace, international organizations, diversionary theory, international courts, conflict management, territorial, maritime, and river issues, and time series analysis. Dr. Mitchell is co-founder of the Journeys in World Politics Workshop, a mentoring workshop for junior women studying international relations. She serves on the editorial boards of a number of academic journals and has received the Faculty Scholar Award 2007 through 10 and the Collegiate Scholar Award 2011 from the University of Iowa. Dr. Paul Van Hooft is the Senior Strategic Analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies and the co-chair of the Initiative on the Future of Transatlantic Relations. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Amsterdam and was a Max Weber Fellow in the European University Institute from 2016 to 18. He was a postdoctoral fellow from 2018 to 2020 at the Security Studies Program of MIT, including as a 2018-19 Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow. His work focuses on the origins and logic of the American grand strategy, European grand strategy and security nuclear strategy, Indo-Pacific security, transatlantic relations, alliances, and extended deterrence. Dr. Van Hoof received the 2016 prize from the Dutch and Flemish Political Science Associations for his dissertation on the impact of experiences with war on post-war grand strategy. We are in good hands with knowledgeable scholars. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Reisinger, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and Dr. Paul Van Hoof.
Thanks. We don't have a sort of set, program, but I thought maybe we could go in the order our names are listed and each say a few things, and then maybe we can ask questions of each other or begin taking the Q&A from the audience. So if that's okay with Sarah and Paul, I'll start off with just a little bit, I guess, of some perhaps background on from the domestic politics of Russia that is talked about or has been talked about as possibly influencing what is going on right now. And in the end, what I'm going to say is I'm not sure that the domestic politics is much of a driving force. I think our experts on the international side of this may have more pertinent perspectives on it. But let me start with some of the domestic roots, perhaps, of this recent troop buildup by Russia in areas surrounding Ukraine. We know that Vladimir Putin has been emphasizing Russia's history in his appeal for public support, in the way that issues are framed and policies are framed, and he himself is very concerned about his place in it. And so it's important to be aware that some of the themes or lessons that many Russians learned from their long 1,000+ year history as a state, and that are emphasized by Putin and others in the leadership, include that Russia is territorially vulnerable, that any social disorder, such as the kind democracy would produce, compounds the country's vulnerability to outside attack, and that the best response to such territorial vulnerability is to move Russia's borders farther away from the population center by acquiring territory. And these ways of thinking about Russia clearly resonate with Putin. They don't, of course, explain why we see the events we've seen in recent months, why things in 2021 have happened the way they did. But as they seem to fit together, perhaps with some increased emphasis on Putin's part with his own legacy. As one Russian official put it off the record, Putin is turning 70 this year. And he knows that in the sweep of Russian history, the rulers who get to be called the Great are the ones who dramatically expand Russia's territory. So perhaps that's some part of it. And many people think that he has begun emphasizing his legacy more than in earlier years. More pertinent to the why now question is that the domestic political situation in Russia seems to be very well controlled. Putin is somewhat less popular than he has been at times in the past, but his public support remains solid, and a majority of Russians would support the country's efforts in this situation, whatever they turn out to be. Now, some commentators have stated that Putin cannot back down from an invasion at this point. But in terms of domestic affairs, in any case, he certainly could. He won't get a big bump in public opinion as he did after annexing Crimea in 2014. Russians are not wild about a conflict that would involve lots of troops and associated casualties. And invading Ukraine would not produce a quick, almost bloodless victory that seemed to really make many Russians very happy in 2014. But at the same time, he doesn't have to worry about a strong public backlash if he initiates a war. He has eliminated almost all opposition voices and all spaces for opposition to be expressed. There really couldn't be, in the short run, any sort of anti-war movement that he would have to contend with. In most sectors of the Russian economy, the economy is stagnant, and but along with that stagnant situation, along with relatively slow modernization and improvement in things, has come a kind of barricading of the economy from outside sanctions. Russia's debt situation is very enviable. It has large reserves of gold and cash. They're experimenting with ways to transact international trade without using dollars. So in a lot of ways, they're trying to make the suffering the public would do from international sanctions as small as possible and encourage Russians to muddle along for patriotic reasons. Also, because of constitutional changes done in 2021, he does not have to worry about any term limits and figuring out some way to get around them. And term limits just kind of cause turmoil in the elite. And so he's in a situation now where he doesn't have to worry about that. Moreover, a bigger share of Russia's elite right now is hawkish, particularly those who are close to him. Those elites who are not interested in any kind of war with Ukraine, the business elites, technocrats, those interested in modernizing the economy, they're really not in any kind of position to influence the course of events. So the hawkish voices are the loudest ones right now. Also, there are many indications that Putin is not taking as much time on decisions. He's not consulting as broadly as he was credited with doing in the first decade of his time in power. And so his decisions are more sharply influenced by a narrower set of people, which is not often the best way to have decisions made. So that may be playing into some of this too. Also in 2021, another factor is that in the country of Belarus, next door, an ally of Russia, the 2020 protests against the leader, Lukashenko, translated into harsh repression and Lukashenko becoming much closer to Russia, sort of throwing himself into the arms of Putin, so that now Putin knows that he can count on full-throated support from the Belarusians. And Lukashenko has indicated in recent weeks that Belarusian troops would join any military conflict on Russia's side. Let's see, the prices for oil and natural gas increased throughout 2021, and they form a substantial part of Russia's state budget. So that would be something that would alter the calculations as well. The current price of oil is around $85 a barrel, which is quite a bit higher than it was even before the pandemic. Also, the Russian military is more capable and better prepared than it had been in the past. They have more professional soldiers as part of their troops. They're about 45% of Russia's 900,000 troops right now. They had been much less, say 10 years ago, and Russia's made a concerted effort to bring in more of these better trained personnel and reduce the share of draftees in the armed forces. They've also, of course, been building new weaponry, replacing outdated equipment, and they're training more, and they're learning how to use these equipment with a lot more frequent exercises. And of course, the involvement in the Syrian war gave particularly their air power a lot of experience that makes them just a more capable military force than before. So for a whole variety of reasons then, at least looking at it from the domestic politics point of view, Putin has a really wide range of options available to him, I think without any pushback that he couldn't handle. So all the way from invading and occupying the entirety of Ukraine to initiating military conflict that's less grandiose, so only a certain portion of territory, or that doesn't really occupy any territory at all, or on the other end, just finding some diplomatic victory and then returning the troops to their pre-2021 locations and posture and diffusing the crisis. And because he has such a wide range of options, of course, nobody can figure out really what is going on, what is going to happen. Although, you know, every day in the media, you read someone saying, well, this has got to be the what will happen, or, you know, this is impossible, or that's impossible. And, you know, from the point of view of Putin's command of Russian politics, I think he can do any or all of those things. So with that said, I would like to hear from my colleagues more maybe about what other factors might be influencing what's going on. So I'm happy to turn it over to you, Sarah.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I organized some of my thoughts around some questions that Bill sent to us ahead of time. So I'm going to start with the first one he asked us, which is, what does international relations research tell us about the reasons for Russia's buildup and demands? I think it's really interesting. If you watch the news right now, a lot of the framing around this conflict is you know, NATO versus Russia, great power politics framing. And so if you think about, you know, what are Russia's demands in the conflict, they want NATO to not expand to Ukraine or other ex-Soviet countries. They don't want NATO deploying offensive weapons near Russia. They want NATO to roll back deployments to Eastern Europe. Conversely, on the other side, you hear the Biden administration saying that countries can choose, you know, which alliances they want to join, that we're going to make sure that Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty are protected, that they want Russia to de-escalate and withdraw from Ukraine's borders, and to reduce support to insurgents in the Donbas region. But I think if we can also think about this conflict, you know, in terms of broader structural factors that set the conditions for war in this particular case. And in my international conflict class this week, we did a kind of interesting exercise where we took a model by Stuart Bremer called dangerous dyads. And then we applied it to the Russia-Ukraine situation. And Bremer identifies essentially 7 factors that make war likely between countries. And he, you know, of those 7 things, Russia, Ukraine basically have 6 of the risk factors present. So they have a contested land and sea border, which Bremer finds to be the largest factor. You know, contiguity makes conflict more likely, which makes sense. They're both highly militarized and advanced economies, which he finds can increase the risks for war. There's a major power in this in the dyad, Russia, which increases chances for war. Neither country is democratic. They both have a series of outside alliance commitments that could increase war risks. And I would say the one thing that pushes towards peace is that Russia, in terms of overall capabilities, is 5 times larger than Ukraine. And so in this model, there's a median power difference, as Bremer calls it, between the countries. And so that could diminish the chance for war, because the probability, right, that Russia would win in that head-to-head is very high. My own research suggests that another reason this dyad is dangerous is because they have a series of diplomatic conflicts that have been going on for some time. So they have disagreements over sovereignty of Crimea. Once Russia took control, Ukraine contested that. They've had delimitation in the Sea of Azov conflicts that go back to since Ukrainian independence. That led, of course, to a clash in December 2018 when Russia, fired at and seized 3 Ukrainian naval vessels and captured 23 crew members. We also have seen conflicts over identity issues between the countries. So Russia complaining about the treatment of ethnic Russians in Ukraine and some of the policies which Ukraine has actually rolled back somewhat in the last couple of years. So my first take on this is that, yes, this is a great power conflict, but there are, Russia and Ukraine already had a series of ongoing conflicts, and they have a history essentially that could set the stage for this. Bill mentioned the idea of, are there domestic incentives for war? So I've done some work on diversionary theory, and we can think about whether, yes, Putin got a huge boost, right? He went from low 60s to around 90% approval after Crimea, and that approval stayed there for 4 years at the, around the 88 to 90% level. And so he definitely got a boost from domestically from the, the taking of the Crimea. This is obviously a potentially different situation, as Bill said. The Russian public is not as in favor of this invasion. The costs, of course, militarily would be much greater if there was an attempt to take a larger piece of territory. But in our work, we find that authoritarian leaders who have high inflation levels are more likely to initiate conflict against rival states. And if we look at the pattern of inflation in the last year, like many countries, Russia's inflation has increased over 3% in the last year. And so at least our work would suggest that this is, again, another risk factor for potential war between these countries. Are there historical analogies that could be applied to this case? I was thinking about that. I mean, I think the first Gulf War is a good potential analogy here. Because that also was a situation where a country was invading Iraq, was invading Kuwait, and President Bush, led a coalition effort to repel that invasion. At the time, Bush talked about defending, Saudi Arabia and our oil interests in the region. But I think it's kind of an interesting analogy, right? Because we didn't have direct alliance ties to Kuwait, but rather we had ties to other states in the region like Saudi Arabia. And so that hopefully this conflict doesn't go the same direction, right? Because even though the US and its partners put over 500,000 troops in the ground in the Middle East, it did not stop a war from happening between Iraq and those countries. So I do think it's interesting to think about, whether, if as we see this kind of security dilemma unfolding as Putin is building up more troops and equipment near the border, but also President Biden, right, announced today that he's going to be sending, he has 8,500 troops on alert, but we're committing 2,000 additional troops beyond what we have in Europe. And we're going to be moving some of those troops to Poland, Romania, sending more reinforcements to Germany. So I think, this is another thing we talked about in my class this week is sometimes countries, to protect their own security they each take moves to protect themselves. And this can lead to what we call a security dilemma because each side perceives that what they're doing is defensive, but the other side perceives those moves as offensive. And so unfortunately, like we saw in the first Gulf War, these series of moves could potentially lead to war, even if the parties could find a deal that would make them better off diplomatically. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. The last thing I want to say is that, kind of going back to this point on diversionary incentives, Bill mentioned that Putin has been talking about, connecting what's happening to the history of the country. And he says things like Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are one people. They're descendants of ancient Rus. So I do think if you look at the policy, the document that Putin authored last summer, that's a little troubling because it does push in this direction of a kind of path of irredentism that would, I like Bill's way of thinking about this as Putin's legacy potentially. So when I read things like that, that makes me very nervous, because we know from past wars that irredentist claims, right, have been the source of really costly and severe wars in history. So I hope that that's not where this situation is going, but if that was the motive, it would suggest that he's not just trying to get something more through diplomacy by moving his forces to the border, but that he actually would have incentive to initiate war, even against all of these odds that seem to be in front of him. Thanks.
All right. Well, I think Bill and Sarah just did an excellent job of saying most of the things I could think of beforehand. So let me just put it in, instead of saying what could motivate it, some of the things that I don't think are motivating it. Obviously, as Sarah mentioned, the NATO enlargement issue has come up repeatedly, and it's been a convenient way of framing this. I would say even more so in Europe for a long time. It was the so-called Russlandversteher, the German, specifically in Germany, but also the rest of Europe, those who would kind of make excuses for Russian aggression. Have pointed to NATO enlargement in the late 90s and early 2000s. But I think that's, for various reasons, I don't think that's a convincing explanation. For one, what I think is conveniently forgotten is that during those major rounds of NATO enlargement, at the same time, Western Europeans were cutting massively in their defense budgets, and were entirely transforming their armed forces towards more expeditionary warfare, peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, because at the same time as enlargement happened, it was the slogan in the 90s, NATO out of area or out of business. And those two things, I think, were not strategically very sound, but it also meant that by the time we get to 2014, the kind of European armed forces that could properly threaten could threaten Russia hardly existed, and even the US had moved out, its heavy armor from Europe. So there's a kind of argument where I don't think it's NATO enlargement by itself is not convincing. In contrast, I think it's something that was overdetermined to a sense. Yes, there's a Russian history, there's a Russian perception of itself as a great power and as a desire to be treated as such. There's various things that the US did unilaterally during the same period: the suspension of the ABM Treaty in 2002, the placement of Aegis missile defense, the invasion of Iraq. Some have argued that when the US set aside Russian concerns during the Libya crisis 11 years ago, that was the last drop. So I think there's more relative to be said for it being sort of mostly overdetermined. Likewise with Ukraine, I think Sarah listed all of them. There's nothing new about the tensions with Ukraine. That was seen as a default line of future Russian-Western relations all the way back in the 90s, immediately at the end of the Cold War. So there's some ways in which is overdetermined. So why now? And I think that's a difficult question. There's something to be said for the prestige argument, because I think, as Bill pointed to, there's not that many things to gain in Ukraine itself. But the prestige argument might be very convincing, that Putin would like this for prestige, not so much for diversionary warfare purposes, but one of my colleagues, who is Ukrainian, mentioned that Putin might be looking for a way out, looking for a retirement plan, looking for a way to kind of step out of the limelight, and wants to protect himself, wants to position himself as a great leader who showed the adversaries of Russia that Russia was back on stage, and that would kind of give him an out and keep him well enough protected to enjoy that immense pile of wealth that he's amassed through illicit means over over the last decades. I think that's I thought that was an interesting idea and something that I find sort of potentially convincing. So in terms of analogies, I think it's difficult to find a good analogy. The Gulf War would be an interesting one in some ways, but at the same time, Iraq was not a nuclear power. So in terms of intervention in Ukraine, the US and its allies would be much more limited and would, for very obvious, sensible reasons, look to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia, but probably also vice versa. The one analogy that I think is the one that is the most overused analogy of the last 80 years, which would be the Munich Analogy. And I think that one is a very dangerous one in this case, because then the similarities obfuscate quite a few differences that would suggest much more aggressive policies than I think are sustainable. So why isn't it? Well, why would it be Munich? You know, the appeasing a dictator, giving him what he wants as he takes more and more, thereby emboldening him, and so on. But Ukraine is not an ally, very obviously, because that's where this all started. Ukraine is not an ally of any of the major states. Also, the occupation or partial occupation of Ukraine would not change the European balance of power in the same way that Czechoslovakia, which in the 30s had quite significant military power that then could be added to German power. That's just simply not the case here. Right? The Russian economy might be much sounder, and we should not underestimate it. Much sounder than it was 10, 15 years ago. But at the same time, it's not really well positioned to engage in this kind of larger series of conquests over Europe. And those are things that I think are quite obvious, but should also caution us from thinking of that particular analogy. One analogy that I think would be maybe a little bit more appropriate, as a risk at least, is the appearance of settling the future of Eastern Europe over the head of Eastern Europeans. So the analogy would be more something like Yalta. And I think, for instance, a lot of what Macron, the French are trying to do is, in a sense, more inspired the idea of at least getting an independent line of communication to Putin is very much, I think, in line with the idea of making sure that Europe, at least the major powers in Europe, continue to play a separate role with Russia, not to concede so much as to make sure that they're also on the table. But that by itself is another kind of risk and I think a real failure of Western European imagination is to very quickly overlook the interests and very legitimate fears of Central and specifically Eastern European member states of the EU and of NATO. So in terms of analogies, I think that's the more appropriate. I think we've talked about motivations. I'll leave it there, and then I have some remarks maybe for another round on what this might mean for European security and like NATO and EU. But I'll leave it here for now, maybe.
Great, thank you. I think we'll move on to the Q&A period of our program. So if you have a question, please submit it to the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen in Zoom. Feel free to turn on your video function so our speakers might be able to see you, but please keep yourself muted. While we're waiting for questions to come in, ICFRC wants to thank all of its members and donors for their support. If you would like to join ICFRC or make a gift to support our programs, please go to icfrc.org. Thank you. Okay, let me pull up the chat where we've seen a few questions already. I think I'll address the first one here. Dr. Reisinger has listed a number of factors compelling Putin to ignite such a crisis. Do you think the demographic factor, which is so challenging in Russia, could be a key driver behind such huge tensions? I'm not sure about the demographic factor, but perhaps you can touch on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, Russia has big demographic problems, has had at least, well, since before the 1990s, even exacerbated by the economic problems in that decade, and its population decline, which, then creates future periods of low population growth. And there's a lot of problems. Putin has made it a policy emphasis to try to boost Russia's population. I don't think that is a factor that can help us understand things going on over the last year vis-a-vis Ukraine or other kinds of foreign policy actions, in part because Russia did make improvements. So they combated the declining birth rate and reduced the death rate somewhat from the 1990s. Population declines leveled off a little bit, although in the COVID crisis, it's been rekindled, but they are not having problems finding personnel for their military, for one thing. So as a strategic issue, I don't think the declining population yet in the short run is something that would be seen as a danger to the country's strength. And it's certainly something that they're going to have to attend to in the years ahead. They, like the United States, rely on immigrant labor for a lot of key areas, and that has its own kinds of problems, both domestically and in foreign policy. So the demographic issues that Russia faces are serious, but I think they're probably not ones that Putin is worried about in the short run.
Great, thank you. Any other comments on demographics? Okay. How much does Putin's desire to discredit President Biden and lead the way to a second Trump term play a role in this crisis?
Well, it would be hard to know exactly what would be going on in Putin's head, but I think there's an and I forgot where it was, where it was published, but it was an interesting interview with Fiona Hill, I think about 2-3 weeks ago. And because the very good question is, as well, given that Trump was clearly more, more friendly to Putin than Biden is, why now and not, let's say, a year ago? And her argument was, being both a Russia expert and having been in Putin's White House, in Trump's White House, that was a Freudian slip. Having been in Trump's White House, her argument was that Trump was too unpredictable for Putin to risk this, that Trump could go either way, and that very much, certainly after that the Russian government was quite happy having Trump in the White House, but then after 2 years, they were quite exasperated because they were not getting proper answers to requests. There was no serious work being done on proposals they made. It was all very high level, kind of symbolic stuff that Trump was predisposed to. And therefore, they felt they couldn't really make a deal with him or get anything out of it. So the argument would be that now there's something really to gain because Biden will take this seriously, will commit to it, will not overshoot it, but also, maybe land on something that's quite significant.
Great, thanks. The next question is, Russia has always struggled with trade because they only have the one port that doesn't freeze over in the winter. Is one of Putin's goals to open up a shipping route in the Black Sea?
Well, I mean, I think, there's an attempt to build a land bridge in the Kerch Strait. And the question is, whether they want a larger land bridge, to that area. So taking more of the eastern Ukrainian territory would obviously accomplish that. I wanted to talk about Stephen Vlastos's point about, he's basically arguing, right, that the that the expansion of NATO, how would this not be seen as aggressive by Russian leaders? This is a common argument that's been made by a lot of realist scholars like John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. They've essentially argued that NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe is one of the reasons that Russia, has taken these series of steps that have been aggressive, towards Ukraine and other states. I think, Seva Gunitsky, he's a professor at Toronto, had a really good piece in Foreign Policy responding to that. And, he argued that by their own realist theories, they argue that countries have incentives to become regional hegemons. And so Russia has an incentive to establish itself, especially after the dissolution of the Soviet Union empire. You can imagine that today, Putin wants to reestablish some form of regional hegemony. This is why he's had a series of conflicts, with Georgia, with separatist movements like in Chechnya, South Ossetia. So, you could argue that what Putin is doing is taking steps that we would expect, according to realism, for countries that want to become regional hegemons. And so, so is it true that NATO is causing this? NATO expansion is causing this? You can make an argument that it increases pressure, but I think the realist theories would also predict that regional hegemony would have, there would have been a tendency toward it even without NATO expansion in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think if we imagine a counterfactual that indeed we go back to 1997 and we have a reunified Germany and NATO, but nobody else, or maybe we just the first round of expansion, so we'd have Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary. Would that change things drastically from the Russian point of view? Well, maybe we wouldn't be talking about Ukraine now, but one of the other, we might be talking about the Baltic states if they had not been in NATO. So there's a question there if it's a drive for hegemony or simply, under most circumstances, just the desire to have buffer states and to kind of not have anyone close to them, we might have been the same conversation. Moreover, there are some other moves that the US made, like I mentioned, the suspending the ABM treaty. There's other things that the US did that would have unsettled most other great powers. That could be it, but that's the point, right? It's sort of overdetermined. I think the real problem was that NATO was enlarged without thinking anymore of a credible deterrent. Like it became a collective security organization within Europe, arguably, and something else outside of Europe. Right? And those two missions were incompatible, is basically still doing enough to get right next to Russia's borders, but not having the military means at that point to do credible defense or deterrence. I think that's what I mean with when I said it's strategically unsound to do enlargement as the US and Europe did. To do it at the same time as trying to democratize the Middle East, trying to do 100 other things. I think that's where you have a better argument, because that's both overreaching and in some ways created real weaknesses in traditional politics. And then Russia was not really taken into account, right? Missile defense might, the argument might be that a few potential Iranian ballistic missiles are just unbearable to think of, and that Aegis can do nothing but protect maybe against those. But from the Russian point of view, that would make me slightly nervous about deterrence. If there's something in place that might at some point stop enough Russian ballistic missiles. I mean, it's hard to disentangle this, and it's going to be easy to say, well, NATO should just have stayed where it was. But I think you'd have some of the same problems, and some of the real problems that might have been provoked by the West or by the US probably have less to do with NATO than everything else.
We have got a good question here from Ambassador McMullen about the Olympics. With the Winter Olympics coming up very soon, he notes that Russia invaded Georgia during the Beijing 28 Olympics. Any faith in the rumor that she has asked Vladimir Putin not to invade during the Winter Olympics, or what impact does the Olympics have in some of the calculations that we're seeing right now?
Well, I know that Xi has stated publicly that he believes there should be a pause in hostilities, sort of implying worldwide, from 7 days before the Olympics to 7 days after the end of the Paralympics, sort of, modeled on the ancient Greek idea of a truce during the Olympics. So he's put that out there. What that means, for Putin's calculation is unclear. But China's friendship with Russia is a very important part of Russia's sense of security, and so really angering Xi Jinping right now would not be in Russia's interest, would not be something that Putin would be happy to do. So we may in fact see a delay in hostilities until after the Olympics have ended. I don't know about the Paralympics.
Yeah, and I think, I agree that Russia's relationship with China is also important for withstanding any sanctions that would be imposed if they did invade. So, currently 15.5% of China's oil imports come from Russia already. So if, Germany, move forward and sort of cut off the Nord Stream 2 oil and gas supplies coming in, then Russia could redirect that oil towards China in that event. So that relationship is really important for Russia if it does want to be aggressive, for having these economic ties to China to withstand these sanctions that would inevitably follow. That would be imposed. And that could include things like the discussion of kicking Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, not converting rubles to dollars, which would affect their ability to sell oil. So these are the kinds of things that by respecting China's wish to not have a war during the Olympics, that would give them more options on the post February 20th if they decide to invade.
I think I'll ask this next question. Looking at the US's response so far, how is the US doing? Are there some recommendations you'd make going forward for response that's productive?
I think what the US has done so far has been a good strategy. It's essentially reinforcing support to neighboring states like Poland or Romania that we do have NATO alliance ties with. And so it's a reassurance of our alliance partners that if Russian aggression were to expand beyond Ukraine, that we would be there defensively to support those countries. I think maybe one criticism I would have is it seems like there's a lot of negotiations happening without Ukraine at the table. And I feel like Ukraine's government needs to be more central to those negotiations. We saw that in Afghanistan, right? When the Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban, right? It kind of cut out the Afghanistan government, and that, I just don't think that strategy tends to end very well. So I think in this case, I would recommend that the administration be more proactive in getting Ukraine's leadership at the negotiation table, making sure that their interests are represented.
The next question I'll ask, there are a few questions in the chat about Taiwan and China and what we might learn from the current issue with Ukraine and Russia for Chinese and Taiwan relations and potential conflict and US involvement. If you might speak about some parallels or maybe some key differences that you see, I think that would be helpful for our audience.
Yeah, I'm less of an expert probably than the other two guests, but I'll say that, I think if the United States had kind of backed down quickly to Russia's Russia's buildup and given in to some of the demands, that would have set a bad precedent. But also, the United States commitment to Taiwan goes further back and has included some, rather aggressive military maneuvers and other things going back to the Chinese shelling of Quemoy and Matsu Islands. So I think in some ways the Chinese probably think of the U.S. Commitment to Taiwan as being much stronger than our commitment to Ukraine's security. But anyway, I'll listen to if others disagree with that.
Yeah, I would say that. So that I agree with. I also think that there's several distinctions there. The one being that Taiwan is more important strategically. It changes the balance of power in the Western Pacific. It allows China to project power into the region to expand its so-called A2AD bubble much further, and so on and so on. So Taiwan is more important than Ukraine is for potential future aggression. What I think is the point that I don't think one will spark the other or will motive, whatever Russia manages to accomplish in Ukraine I don't think necessarily shapes what Xi Jinping will try to do. I think the more important part here, or the overlooked part, is that both, as soon as the temperature goes up in one of these two hotspots, it makes it difficult for the US to focus on the other one. And US capabilities are not, relative to everyone else, are not at the same level that they were 20 years ago. The US does not have the kind of lead that it had during the height of the unipolar moment. That means that you can only reinforce or deter really well in one region at a time. And if Russia and China can informally or formally try to coordinate, not invasions per se, but just aggression, heightened, and then you can use that as a bargaining chip. Which, if I can segue somewhat into maybe something that I don't think we've really talked about, is then what role for Europeans here? So among the questions that Bill sent around beforehand was what will this mean for NATO and potential, the quest in Europe for the last few years to get greater EU strategic autonomy. And I think there's two ways to see it. One, the crisis, especially if this crisis completely escalates, would underline that right now, as it was in the past, but clearly in a very dangerous situation, NATO is the only game in town that really matters. It's the only one that can do proper deterrence, proper defense, and the rest of it. And for that, you need the US. That would be one way to see it. The other one would be, well, in a world where the US resources are more and more strained, at some point, Europeans will need to be able to take on greater burden. And especially if, and I think that's a relatively easy argument to make, if the greater threat, or at least the greater challenger to US power and to the order we have now is in Asia, well, then that's where probably US resources will go, and probably where they should go, which would mean that Europeans would have to do more to do defense, deterrence, and be less dependent on the US moving first, or everything basically being the central hub through which everything security related goes through in Europe. So I think there's two ways in which this could matter. And there are some signs that Washington's understanding this, at least to some extent, is that autonomy could be, as if conceived more as something like the EU as a pillar, those things as a pillar within a security pillar within NATO, could be something that actually gives the US more leeway to focus on China, or at least to also reinforce different regions at different times, depending on where a crisis might arise.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. I completely agree that Taiwan, from a strategic perspective, is viewed as a much more important area. When I went to a conference at the Naval War College, it was very clear that defense of Taiwan is a really high priority for U.S. Navy, more so than other things that we discussed. I think, we've seen with this administration in the last two, there's clearly this pivot to Asia, as it's called. So an attempt to reposition our forces more in the East Asia region. And the Biden administration is continuing that pivot to Asia. They created the AUKUS pact with Australia and the United Kingdom. They're going to sell nuclear submarines to Australia as part of that. They've pledged to keep the tariffs in place on China that the Trump administration enacted. They're now negotiating a new Indo-Pacific economic framework, not necessarily a trade agreement, but an attempt to shore up our supply chains with respect to semiconductors and other technology. They're in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed in December. It basically lays out a blueprint for surrounding China with, a network of bases, military forces, and partner states that are more militarized. And so part of that includes the $7.1 billion in funding for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And so that would, so again, the strategy here is to bolster our allies in East Asia, their ability to defend themselves and to protect our interests in that region. And so I thought it was interesting today, the Pentagon said that the 2,000 troops that are going to Romania, Poland, or Germany, that these are temporary. So they made it very clear that this is not a permanent increase in the European forces. And I thought that was kind of consistent with this idea that we're going to respond to the situation, but we're still going to, maintain our strategic pivot to Asia, so to speak, going forward.
Great, thank you. I think we're near the end of our program, so let me move into our conclusion. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Reisinger, Dr. Mitchell, and Dr. Van Hoff for their excellent presentations and sharing their expertise with us today. I am honored to virtually present you each with a ICFRC highly coveted mug for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice. We will coordinate delivery details with you very soon. ICFRC's next program is on Wednesday, February 9th at 12 noon via Zoom. This will be the next program in our series, Refugees and Immigrants in Iowa, and will focus on how COVID-19 has impacted these populations. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are adjourned.